I'm going to get on to Guyana and your love of that other home of yours a little bit later on. But frankly, there's only really one place where we should start on this of all days. And I just wonder, how did you come to hear exactly a year ago today that there was a tower on fire in North Kensington?
Hi there, Browne here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Feel free, like, subscribe, and welcome to my time tunnel. Hi, I'm with you again. Welcome back to the time tunnel. Today we're going to continue down the time tunnel, but let's take a look at someone very important. And I'm going to switch from culture. This time I'm looking at a member of parliament. His name is David Lammy. David Lammy, member of parliament here in the United Kingdom. David Lammy was born in Archery, North London, to Guyanese parents, David and Rosalind Lammy. There's a lot more to David Lammy, but I'll say no more because I have got Clive Meyer. He's an English television news journalist who works for the BBC, and Clive will be having a discussion with David Lammy to ask him about his life and all the things that he's been involved in over the years as a member of parliament. So I hand you over to Clive Meyer and, of course, our great MP, Mr. David Lammy.
I'm going to get on to Guyana and your love of that other home of yours a little bit later on. But frankly, there's only really one place where we should start on this of all days. And I just wonder, how did you come to hear exactly a year ago today that there was a tower on fire in North Kensington?
Well, I woke up early, I think it was about 5. I tend to wake quite early. Sometimes I go back to sleep, but often I don't. And so I had a quick glance at my phone, my iPhone, and it was ringing off the hook. It had been ringing, and I could see lots of alerts, political alerts from the various media outlets and from the Labour Party and other things. So I knew that something was seriously up. I assumed it was a terrorist event. And then as I looked, I saw that it was Grenfell Tower that was on fire, and I could immediately see the burning. And then on the messaging side, I could see that there were some personal messages that had come through to me and my wife. And then I glanced over to her phone and saw that her phone had been absolutely ringing off. And what transpired in the next half hour was that Khadija Say, who had interned, my wife and I make it our business to try and mentor young, mainly ethnic minority young people, obviously myself in politics and law, and my wife generally in the arts, because she's an artist. Khadija, she had met Khadija and her mother a few years earlier because she had put Khadija forward she was judging a competition, a national competition, and being my wife, she was keeping a keen eye on the black and ethnic minority applicants to this national competition. And Khadija turned up with her mother, and Nicola made sure she got through. And then she gathered Khadija up, and the messages were basically that at that stage that they were missing. But I mean, I warned Nicola that to fear the worst, because I know how this story of missing can turn out. And we found out the worst a few days later, and that's how I got into it. I've always said on Grenfell, I don't claim to be neutral or impartial, which is what some people like in their politicians. I am not impartial, I am completely engaged. But I'd like to think, even if Khadija and her mother had not died, and let me just say, Khadija was found found on, they lived on the 22nd floor. Khadija was found on the 9th floor. Her mother was found on the, I think, the 17th floor. I know that story. I know that story because, you know, I love both my parents dearly, but my father did leave us when I was younger, and my mother raised us, and I know what it means to not want to leave your mother behind. And that is why Khadija's not with us. And they're also not with us because I also know that many in this audience will know there's a, you know, I don't know, how can I put this? Immigrants, working class people, we trust people in uniform. Most people. But when they say officials, the civil servant types that ran the colonies, and when they say stay put if there's a fire, we're the last people to break the rules. And that advice was the wrong advice, and that's why they lost their lives. So, but I'd like to think that, you know, the thing is when you have the kind of backgrounds that many of us have, you know, and you grow up in London, you tend to know, you know, you have different family and different friends in different parts of London, and I'm thinking back to the 70s and 80s, and, you know, and you have friends in Brixton, they live in the estates there, friends in Tottenham, they live in Broadwater Farm, friends in West London, they live in Grenfell Town. You kind of know these areas, right? And so there's something deeply personal. When we saw this fire, we looked at the people's faces, there but for the grace of God go I. This was me, that was this is how deep we felt it. And that was how I took it on. And actually, I might say that Windrush was exactly the same.
Sure. 2 tower block fires, by the way, today. And after a few minutes, most of the people in the blocks ran. They didn't hang around. That's part of the legacy of Grenfell already. You're a black Brit, as I'm a black Brit. We were both born here. What did Grenfell tell you that you didn't already know about the society that we live in? Or did it simply reaffirm long-held beliefs that perhaps you've always thought of this land?
I've got to say, I don't think Grenfell told me anything that I didn't already know as a practicing frontline politician. I want to go back a few years earlier. I had sincerely believed, and I would have gone to the wall on it, that race relations, integration, social cohesion had improved. I would have had a good row, not aggressive, but I would have got involved, engaged with those that said, oh no, things have not got better.
Same here.
It was same as they were for our parents' generation. You know, no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. Yeah, I would have been this. And I think that I've begun to realise as we approached the Brexit debate and the aftermath of it, that I must have got lulled into a false sense of complacency. And I was wanting to literally kick myself. And if we went back a few years, I could, you know, you could kick me, come give me a good kick, because I can't believe I was seduced into that myth. Because it's a myth, and so that's the deep depression. So it was before Grenfell that I was beginning to feel very, very clear that things had not improved to the extent that I'd thought. But having said that, the political establishment is in part to blame for some of this, because there is a ping pong between fringe views, you know, we would say the National Front, and some of those really on the hard right of politics, and these views that are on the fringe but are in the mainstream. And I guess the truth is that Enoch Powell was in the mainstream. He wasn't on the fringe. He was a leading Conservative politician who'd been a minister. And very, very sadly, in 2018, we find that these issues that I would like to consign to the fringe, and frankly can feel on the fringe when the economy is good, are not on the fringe. They are they're in the mainstream as well, and they can be adopted by the mainstream. And by the way, I include my own party in that. So the quest for social justice, the quest for racial harmony, is a perennial quest, I'm afraid, and it moves back and forth. That's my judgment, and we're living in perilous times where these issues are contested, and if you just look at my Twitter feed, you will see that these views are, I'm accused of race baiting, I'm accused of virtue signalling. Since when has virtue been a bad thing? I'm accused of playing the race card. I'm accused of having a chip on my shoulder. Well, if I've got a chip on that shoulder, I've certainly got one on the other as well. I'm accused by Oxford of being bitter. What am I bitter about? I went to Harvard, man. I had a wonderful man, his parents. I'm not bitter. So I'm afraid the truth is that this stuff is out there, and why I mention it in relation to Grenfell is because I thought after Grenfell, there was despite the horrors in the days that follows, British people, black and white, rich and poor, sent clothes, sent food, came down, supported. It was a wonderful tribute to this country. But the truth is, there was also what we call othering. There was also, in the weeks that followed, an attempt to say, but these people are immigrants, that these people are here illegally. Why were they here? To cast aspersion because of how they looked. And some elements of the media have participated in that. And I know that many of the survivors feel that personally. Yes, there were some fraudsters, but very sadly in modern life there are fraudsters in every tragedy. There are people who try to raise money from a charity that's not really a legitimate charity. There are people who try to claim that someone died and see if they can get some of the compensation. That happens in every single... Why would you pick these people out and somehow build them up and say this is Grenfell? This is not Grenfell. This is not at all.
What I think makes you an interesting Member of Parliament is the fact that not only are you involved in these causes, but you're front and centre. And I think that's the key difference between you and a lot of other MPs. You are a voice of rage and a voice of anger, but also a voice asking for, calling for solutions and answers. And that's important. But you mentioned Oxford and the controversy over not enough BAMEs being admitted to that institution. You mentioned Windrush, of course, and Grenfell. I just wonder if you can think of other MPs who are as front and centre on so many big issues. I mean, I can think of Stella Creasy and equality for women and so on. But it's several causes that you're involved in, and I just wonder if that has redefined for you what it means to be an MP.
There's a couple of things going on. The first thing to say is that in these peculiar times, a lot of the activity in both political parties is on the backbenches. In the Conservative Party, people like Anna Soubry, sadly Jacob Rees-Mogg, are big figures who've got power. And sometimes you might look at the front bench of the current government, and even the Prime Minister would appear powerless to the backbenchers that sit behind us, that sit behind her, that particularly have views on Brexit. And it is also the truth that in the Labour Party, there are backbenchers who have more power than they might do. And clearly the Labour Party has been divided around Europe particularly. There are people like Chris Leslie, Chuka Umunna and others who have a power in their own right. And then there are interesting new MPs like Jess Phillips, who have become kind of big names really and treasures. And I suppose I'm in that tradition because I chose not to take a front bench position in the previous administration, and I've just been very comfortable in my skin doing what I do. I'm not one of these MPs that's mooching around, oh, it's only a Labour not in power. I feel like I've been able to do a lot. I've worked cross-party. David Cameron asked me to do a review on the criminal justice system and the treatment of black and Asians and minority ethnic people, and I really got into that and said what needed to be said about, why we are so caught up in the criminal justice system. We might touch on that again later. And then these things that have come up. So then the third bit that I want to say is that I grew up in a Guyanese home where particularly my mother was doing about politics. People then got killed, it was absolutely, politics was something quiet that we talked about, but it wasn't something that we jumped up and down about. If someone knocked on your door and said, can you put this Labour poster in your window? We were Labour, but I'm not sure we're necessarily, put it in our window. I'm not sure about that. And actually when I told my mother that I wanted to be a politician, she cried. She was not happy, but of course it's ethic to becoming a barrister, I mean the QC, and you want nasty politics, and and obviously because of the history of Guyana and the politics being problematic in Guyana, this is not something that Guyanese people rush to, because we are very sad about the division that exists in politics in Guyana particularly. And many of the Caribbean islands have a similar story. So the point is, I believe in speaking truth to power. I am able to do this job for a number of important reasons that do not get discussed in national life in Britain, Clive, and that's why it's so wonderful that you're interviewing me, and it's so wonderful that I have this audience. But let me just say some of those reasons that never ever get discussed when you're doing an interview with Nick Robinson or whatever. I'm a Christian is the first thing, right? So I'm not one of those people that gets my politics entirely from The Guardian. I am a Christian socialist. That matters to me, and it speaks to a tradition in the parenting that I had and in the culture before then. I am able to do my job because I am blessed to have enough resources between me and my wife to travel back to the Caribbean very, very regularly indeed. And it's very important to me that my mixed race children understand Guyana and understand what it means to come from Guyana. And I'm very, very blessed that I was able to spend last summer there, and we'll be back there at Christmas, and we'll be back there again. So I can stand in the ground because I know who I am, and because I know who I am, I know where I'm going. I'm also blessed to be educated. It was important for me to go to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, very radical university, out there in terms of left-wing politics, but also to go to Harvard University, to know people like Henry Louis Gates, to know people like the former President of the United States. This is empowering. I am blessed. So the idea with all of that and more, that I'm going to then come back to Britain and sit on my backside and say nothing when there's so much going wrong is just insane. So of course I speak truth to power, and I'm not, and by the way, I am blessed with enough going on in myself and between me and my wife, that the other great thing that I've got going on now is I'm not looking for someone else's patronage. I'm not looking for Jeremy Corbyn to ring me up. I'm not looking for Ed Miliband to ring me up. I'm not looking for the BBC or someone this to do this. I'm doing it on my own. And if you're not looking, my God, you're a dangerous black man. Yes.
Okay. What do your
Amen.
Follow that. What do your white constituents in Tottenham think of your campaign?
Oh, they're fantastic. Look, I found over the last couple of years, broadly, that the reaction to me and the things I stand up for and the things I'm about in London is tremendous. I had a young man on the tube yesterday, tall, white, 23, at medical school. David, you're fantastic. Please, can I have a selfie on the tube? The people of London who are teachers, social workers, professors, the liberal classes of London, the white working class people that work alongside black and ethnic minority people know it. In London, I feel at home, and the love I get from the population of London, whatever their ethnicity, is more than I could have ever have imagined, and is deeply, deeply satisfying and emboldens me even further. I'm very, very grateful for the love that I get from your average Londoner, black or white, and obviously particularly young Londoners, I would say under the age of 40, are whatever the colour of their skin, are very on side. Now, if I travel out, I'm not going to name check places out of London. It's not the same. I'd be absolutely not telling the truth if I said it was the same. It's not the same. There are definitely people who would come up to me and challenge me for some of the positions that I have taken. And that is not just the issues you've mentioned. I took a very strident position on Brexit. Very early on, I said this is madness. I did not think it was in the interests of my constituents. My constituents didn't vote for it, by the way. And I was very, very firm I'm not having any child. And why? Again, because I know where I stand. I am not lining up with the politics of Nigel Farage, of Jacobs Rees-Mogg. I know which side them people them are on, and I am on a different side. And so I was very, very, very clear in my mind what drove this subject, the subject of immigration and what that's really about. And for some of those ethnic minorities whose doors I knocked on, he said, well, you can vote on Brexit. Look, Windrush. What's that wonderful, first they came for and then they came for you. British citizens deported and told if you went for a funeral or a wedding that you can't come back. And we stopped deporting people in 1868 when we stopped sending criminals to Australia. And we're doing it on the quiet. No debate in Parliament about this, but this is what's happening.
Just picking up on that, and my brother was caught up, my stepbrother was caught up in the whole Windrush disaster. And you talked about not being able potentially to be the kind of politician that you are in London, but outside the capital.
No, I'm the same guy, but I might not be.
But you couldn't
laud it.
But you couldn't do it. Okay, if you were the MP for Bolton, do you think you could behave the way you behave?
Well, actually, you're seeing, and you saw in the rebellion last night in the Labour Party, where we had a big, big rebellion. A third of the Parliamentary Labour Party did not vote with the party position. Many of those colleagues were Northerners, and many of those colleagues, despite the way that some of their electors voted, I believe, because they were seduced by Nigel Farage and Rees-Mogg and the Russians manipulating our election. We don't want to talk about that. We don't like to admit that the Russians have been manipulating our own elections, but that's partly what's happening. But they seduced ordinary people to do that, and these MPs are looking their electors in the eye and saying, look, I'm not a delegate. I have to vote according to my conscience. And I have to look you in the eye and tell you you're going to be a damn sight poorer as a consequence of this. And believe me, when they're telling you, oh, freedom of movement and all the rest of it, let's be clear about this. When the British government goes to negotiate with the Indians for a trade deal, what is the first thing the Indians are going to put on the table? Visas! When they go and negotiate with the Chinese, what is the first thing they're going to put on the table? Visas! And very, very strangely, now that we're developing a skill shortage in the NHS, when they go and talk to the Caribbean, what is the first thing they're going to ask for? Nurses. So the very same story has come right round. And these people in those poor working class areas that thought when they voted leave, it meant some of us would leave. My God, if you were worried about immigration, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. A hell of a lot worse in the coming years.
Yeah. I mean, you've talked a little bit about your family circumstances and your father leaving the home. I think you were 12 at the time. Do you think, you talked about the religion and your your Christianity, and your upbringing determining who you are now as a politician. Do you think your father leaving has moulded the way that you see issues and the way that you campaign?
Yes. We had a debate in Parliament today to commemorate the contribution of the Windrush generation to this country. And it was a wonderful debate. It was a small debate, but I'd encourage all of you, if you just put Hansard into Google and put today's date, you'll see the debate that was. Diane Abbott was on the front bench, I spoke, Dawn Butler and others spoke. And, in reflecting on that Windrush generation, I reflected on the joys. I talked about Moira Stewart and Trevor McDonald coming into our living room and lifting our spirits.
Yeah.
I talked about that link right down to, Sterling and Dele Alli and others, and we'll play for England, they're following a long tradition, Linford Christie, Daley Thompson, all these people that we take such pride from. But I also talked of Stephen Lawrence, of the New Cross house fire, of the Brixton, the Tottenham and the Notting Hill riots. And I also wanted to be absolutely clear that the Windrush story does not just begin in 1948. The Windrush story begins 400 years earlier, when black people were taken from Africa and taken to the Caribbean. And in being taken to the Caribbean, we lost our names, we lost our culture, we lost who we were, and we had to build something new. And you and I have names as a consequence of that, and many of us in this room. And I also would want to associate with the other elements of the Caribbean that make us a very mixed people. I'm thinking in my mind of the indentured labourers that arrived from India to Guyana particularly. Jamaicans will talk about the Syrians, the Lebanese. But we're mix up people. We're a hybrid people. We're a hybrid people. But within that hybridity, there are some really painful truths. We have this tradition in the Caribbean and in black communities where we talk about the baby mother. We take it for granted. And why do we talk about baby mother? Why don't we talk about my wife or my husband? We talk about baby mother because in the plantation, the man could be moved next week. He's got no control over whether he can stay on that sugar plantation. So the baby mother's link to her child is the key, not the husband and wife. And the business of procreation is almost a shared experience because the plantation owner can come and take. And it's just the way it worked, right? These legacies live on. They live on in communities. It's why when we think about why we have a knife and gun crime and epidemic here in London, 78 young people have lost their lives already this year and we're only in June. We think about how that connects to the violence on the streets of Port of Spain or Kingston, or indeed our cousins in the African American cities. That is something to do with that painful legacy of dislocation, of having no role models, of not knowing your history, of your history being robbed, of it not being taught in schools, of having deep questions of self-identity and who you are. As Bob Marley said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. This is a big theme across that black diaspora that are the ancestors of slaves. And, on a simplistic level, it's why I salute the fact that I can take my kids to go watch Black Panther, because they see a tale that they can connect to in a certain kind of way. So when you ask me about my father leaving, that story is a very familiar Caribbean story. Yeah. Growing up without a father is very familiar. Growing up, actually, the story of Windrush, growing up without your parents, you might stay with Granny and go and see it, and all that. The dislocation is a big theme in our experience, and of course it's painful. Of course it's hard. It's why set up the all-party group on fatherhood. It's why I say so much about. It's why I hold my children dear, and I don't talk about this very much in public life for obvious reasons. But I have 3 children, and my daughter is adopted, and again, because my wife and I have the resources and the means, and because of our Christian values, whilst we have 2 birth children, we know that there are mixed race and black children that never get adopted, that are in these care homes, that end up in these figures, that are knifing each other on the streets or and we had the means to make a difference, and the addition of my daughter to our life is the best thing we have ever done as a family, and she's rewarded me much more than we have rewarded her. So yes, it's painful, yes, it's true, but it's a real side of being of that Caribbean experience.
You clearly love your I was going to say your country. There's England, and there's the United Kingdom, and there's Guyana. I'm talking about Guyana. And you go back frequently, and you, as you say, you're going to be there at Christmas as well. You're on record as saying that you're fed up of hearing that Guyana's got potential. Exxon have now dropped a couple of wells and are drilling, and they reckon they're going to be hitting about 500,000 barrels a day around 2020. Is that potential finally going to be met, do you think? Is that what it is with Guyana now?
So
disaster. Someone say disaster.
The story of Guyana is this. Guyana is El Dorado. Many people have gone looking for the gold, but it's slipped through their fingers. The potential is in this immense country. Where everybody lives along the strip of the coastline, and the coastline does not go back very far, and you've got this immense country. Most people don't know the bush, as they would call it, and they're scared of it, and some of that fear is real, and some of that fear is actually a little bit like, the plantation owners saying don't run off kind of thing. And in that country are huge amounts of natural resources, much of which have been raped from the country. And I also said today in Parliament that, look, on the Windrush story, what is this history that is not told in schools, that is not sufficiently discussed, is why so many Caribbean people left the Caribbean when they got the call to come and help Britain after the Second World War. They left because the economies of the Caribbean were largely depressed. After the end of slavery, there were rich plantation holders, and then there were labourers who had begun to make a life for themselves, but not much of a life for themselves. The economy of the Caribbean was falling away as some of the need for sugar and other things and the diversification that the Caribbean needed had not really happened. And the modern tourism that many of the islands have today was not present in 1948. And so people left because basically the Caribbean was a warehouse of former slaves. That's why they left. And so this story of pillaging and going after things in the Caribbean is a very common story. Now look, of course I'm pleased that oil has been discovered in Guyana, and that the fortunes of Guyana will no doubt change as a result of that. In a purely Caribbean sense, we have looked, a lot of Guyanese have had to leave Guyana and travel. I'm not now talking to travel to London or New York or Canada, but travel to other islands within the Caribbean. I have a lot of family, by the way, in Antigua. A lot of my female family are in Antigua, and in a small, narrow, small-minded kind of Guyanese way. I'm looking forward to some of the other Caribbean islands coming to Guyana.
What, like Jamaica?
the other way around. But and a lot of Trinis, by the way.
Yeah, that's true.
But obviously, what I want to see, and I've got to say this politically, I want to see that Guyana is a small country. There are lots of small countries in the Middle East. Let's take Qatar, let's take the United Arab Emirates as a whole, that have discovered oil, and the fortunes of all those local people have been lifted. I would love to see the fortune of the 700,000 or so folk in Guyana lifted. That means we need a sovereign wealth fund that is independent of government, that is properly managed and properly run, that is about long-term investment in Guyana, in the schools, in the people, in trips into the interior to see places like the Kaishel Falls that you should see as a child growing up in Guyana, and that is something that I'm urging the government to be engaged in. So it's not just extraction, it's wealth to the people of Guyana. What I don't want to see is the kind of back pocket ministerial corruption that we've seen in some other parts of the world. Pollute Guyana and shut out the people from the opportunity of wealth and success. So it's a moment in time for the country, and one of the reasons I go back so regularly is because I know the political class and the by the way, of all political parties. I've always stayed separate from some of the local party politics. I know all of the politicians.
Do they seek your advice? Do they want to talk to you about, the way to go forward and stuff? Or is that something you try to sort of take back?
No, how can I put this? I don't go to Guyana empty-handed. I also tend to take people with me to Guyana. To take people, the last trip I was on, I went with Conservation International. Conservation International do a fantastic job in Guyana, run by a great guy called David Singh. We've got Irakrama. We've got the Guyana. The whole of the Guyanas really is the lungs of the planet, and we can't just have oil extraction and mining that destroys the planet. This is very, very important. We are preserving our rainforests. We're not cutting our rainforests down like the Brazilians. And I took some English folk with me alongside that trip. So I don't tend to go empty-handed. Do the Guyanese ask for my advice? Well, it's not entirely the Guyanese temperament to ask for advice. You tend to believe me, no. But it's a mutual friendly dialogue that I'm able to have with both the president and his ministers, but also with the leader of the opposition and his team as well.
We know what your thoughts are on Brexit, but during the campaign there was a lot of talk of, if it's not the European Union, then it's the Commonwealth. We can have trade deals, we can sort of, improve the links between the different countries and the United Kingdom. Do you see Guyana benefiting from that in any particular way?
That depends, doesn't it, on what kind of relationship Britain is now seeking. You see, look, there are clearly some downsides to the European Union and how it has affected the Caribbean region. Let's be absolutely clear on that. But at the same time, when I listen to some of my Conservative colleagues in Parliament, it sounds to me like they're talking about a relationship that is an old imperial colonial relationship. It doesn't feel like the partnership relationship that I think is necessary. When I speak to Caribbean leaders, many of our countries Guyana's 52 years since independence. All of the countries are celebrating independence in different ways. But one of the things that comes across to me is how well they have done with what they were left. And part of that discussion then brings the story of reparations back on the table. Because the truth is that the people who got reparations after slavery were the slave owners. This country stopped paying off the debt to the slave owners in 2015. 2015. No reparations were ever given to any slaves. Now, what Caribbean leaders are saying is, can we have a new relationship that isn't about David Cameron turning up in Jamaica and saying, we're going to build you a prison. And you're going to pay for it. No. Can we have a different dialogue that is about our economic improvement and really starts to recognise some of the legacies that we were left with? How can we mutually be genuinely in partnership? Because of course it's a partnership. There are things that you want, there are things that we would quite like, and that's quite important. So yes, I'm all for trade deals with the Caribbean, but it can't be based on a 1920s understanding of what the colonial relationship will be and what the Commonwealth was in the past. It's got to be based on the Commonwealth today, and the Commonwealth today is a different place. It's a different India. It's a different Nigeria. And indeed it will be a different Guyana. A Guyana with oil. When your oil reserves are drying up in Scotland. So
Yeah, absolutely. You've mentioned your wife and your children. Mixed race, growing up in this country, and I think it's the fastest growing demographic as well in the country. What kind of a Britain do you want to leave there? Bearing in mind the work that you've done on Grenfell, on Windrush, on prison reform, on the legal system. Just sum up for me the kind of place that you want them to be adults in.
Well, I am beginning to realise how blessed, Clive, you and I have been in the period in which we were able to grow up, actually, it's turning out. That if you were coming of age, not for everyone, but there were some possibilities in the 90s and the early noughties that were particularly special. They didn't always feel special at the time, but they turned out to have been quite special. We had during, and this is not being political, but because some of the inheritance was the end of the John Major period, but we basically had 10 consecutive quarters of growth in the British economy. We had Britain coming to terms and being more relaxed about its multicultural heritage. Huge problems like Stephen Lawrence, but upsides as well. By and large. And I thought that would all continue, and I want that to all continue. I want Britain to be relaxed with itself. I like the modernity of modern Britain. We still make a huge contribution. Our humour, our writing, our festivals. There's so much about the way we go about things that I think are amazing. And let me just say, I'm very, very proud, very, very proud to be a parliamentarian for this country. Very, very proud. I go to other countries, but I'm very, very proud to be British. I want that for my children. I've got to say that I think that the world is more, I think that the country is more contested, more divided than I've ever seen it. I feel that the world feels more problematic. The geopolitics of the world is more problematic. We could talk about that for a long time, but let me just give you one simple truth. Whilst we have the Trumps and some of the extremism that we're seeing coming, we've had elections in Italy, Austria, Hungary, Germany that have all gone in the rightward direction, and of course you may also take issue with some of the very leftward direction of other parts also of Europe, and indeed the Labour Party has gone in that direction over here. The real issue in the world is automation. The real issue is that there are some fantastic jobs at the top for which you can get paid a lot of money, particularly if they're global jobs. If you're a heart surgeon, or you're a footballer, or you're running a FTSE 100, or just if you're educated, you went to a good university, you landed in the right place, like Clive. Or indeed, Harvard. Life is good up there. And then there's quite a lot of jobs at the bottom, 0-hour contracts, the leisure industry, care assistants, we're living longer, but this is the casual precariat. And then what's happened is in the middle, my God, there's been a hollowing out of a lot of those jobs. They don't exist. I was qualified as a lawyer now 25 odd years ago, and I couldn't believe that lawyers don't have legal secretaries in the same way. It's all done on a computer. Those jobs have gone, right? And that's causing real problems in the economies of the West. And what that leads to is people finding, why is that happening? And of course, there's a lot of people saying it's happening because of the immigrants. They're coming, they're taking the jobs. It's leading to different trade policies, as we're seeing from Donald Trump. So the world feels more contested. It feels a bit like going back to the Cold War era. And in a way, it's very interesting. Those in the room that are baby boomers, I'm not a baby. I think they're the sort of Gen Xers.
Yes,
we're small mini baby boomers, but not baby boomers. But the baby boomers who are a little bit older, who are living quite long, who were the children of the 60s, what I mean by that is a lot of them, the Hillary Clintons, the Tony, they're all still alive. They're not, not leaving the planet. They're still on the stage. But these folk who, in a sense, if I'm being unkind now, are in part responsible for heating up the planet, for overspending and giving us debt. The Gen Xers came behind them and did much the same thing.
Yeah.
In a way, it's ironic that it's the baby boomers' children, the millennials, who are going to have to fix this stuff. And I have a lot of faith and hope in that younger generation. I think they're great. I meet these young people. They excite me with their vision, their passion. I'm blessed to be able to go into schools, whether it's in Guyana, whether it's in India, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Tottenham. And they're a large generation because their parents have large families. And it's over to them. So it's not so much for me to preach to my children. It's to me to warn and caution my children about the world I think that they're inheriting. But their values, I think, I don't think they see racial division, for example, in the way that others have previously. So their values, I think, in this social media, there are some downsides to social media, but there are some upsides also, are slightly different, and I have a lot of faith and confidence in them.
Finally, would you sit on the front bench again?
Well, I get slightly annoyed with this question. You sit on the front bench. It's like, but Clive, if someone came up to you and said to you, "Do you want to be the next director general of the BBC?
No.
Do you want to be the next editor of the BBC?" It's like, hang a minute.
Well, you don't.
I'm doing what I'm doing well. It's not in my gift who Jeremy Corbyn puts on his front bench. Go ask Jeremy Corbyn. Don't come up. What I'm doing is working really, really hard. And I think I can say a bit provocatively. There are a few people on our front bench in the Labour team. I'm not sure this audience can even name who they are. So how much work are they doing is the question. I know that people can say who I am because of the work I'm doing. So I am comfortable in my own skin. That is not within my gift. I have said to you, I am not living each day waiting for a phone call or waiting for the job I'm doing next. I'm not in that place in my life. I really am not. And I'm lucky to be married to a very successful woman who makes more money than me. So I am doing the job I'm doing. Now the irony is that when you're doing the job you're doing, other people come knocking. So let's see where it leads, but I'm doing the job that's in front of me.
And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, thank you for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe my channel, and let's keep in touch. Carl Browne saying it was fun.